Gernot Wagner, climate economist here. I just finished my first full semester of teaching here, so a quick shout out to several of you from my climate policy class here right now. When you quiz, or when the San Francisco Fed quizzes business leaders about climate risk, the top climate risk is climate policy risk. And there's probably nobody better to talk about this than the person who's literally been giving a speech a week on the floor of the US Senate until 18 or so months ago, when there was hope for, in fact, a major climate policy push. He can't be here with us today because of too much happening in Washington as we speak, but we'll be watching an interview, a Q&A between Bob Litterman, who is here with us and who will be joining me up here very soon, and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, discussing the latest and greatest on the climate policy front in DC.
So, Senator, you've been having a number of hearings before the Budget Committee. What have you been hearing about, and what are you trying to accomplish there?
Well, it's been very interesting. First, big thank you to you for being a leadoff witness, and also for the exceptional work you did putting together the Commodities Futures Trading Commission climate report, which was really the first very good report done by a regulatory agency. And believe it or not, you managed to pull it off under the Trump administration. So huge kudos to you.
Well, thank you.
What we're trying to do is to set the stage for better understanding of the economic risk associated with climate change. It's not just about polar bears and pteropods, and it's also not just about green jobs. There's a real hazard out there, and it's looming. So we had you and Mark Carney talk about the scale of the global hazard, and then we dove down in subsequent hearings into particular risks. The coastal property values crash risk as sea level rise begins to impede in the 30-year mortgage horizon. The very similar forest fire, wildfire adjacent property meltdown that can come when real estate is uninsurable and therefore unmortgageable. We looked at the general proposition of the insurance markets going haywire and creating very considerable drama. We looked at the carbon bubble and what happens when the carbon bubble bursts and people like the Saudis stop propping up the cartel and run for the exits, and the floor drops out of the market to their marginal cost price, which we can't compete with. So we go to zero overnight in international sales. So we've walked through a lot of those different scenarios, and we've had some very, very good witnesses. You and Carney, of course, but also the CEO of Aon, the former chief economist of Freddie Mac. And up against that, our Republican friends have either put witnesses who agree with us, or they've really gone to scrape the bottom of the barrel of the sort of last dregs of climate denial. Some of them have been almost comical.
Yeah, I know when I was there with Mark Carney and Douglas Holt-Eaton, we all agreed that the solution was a carbon tax. What are the other members of the committee that are not on board? What are they thinking?
Well, it's hard to tell. There are a few Republican senators who come in and just spout fossil fuel climate denial rhetoric. But there are others who are, much more engaged. My ranking member is Chuck Grassley. Iowa has a huge wind presence, the biggest wind presence of any state in its electric mix. And it's so present that it actually creates its own reliability because it's predictable. So the ISO's actually baked it into their, baseload planning. Lindsey Graham is working with me on something we can talk about more later, the carbon border adjustment. Mitt Romney keeps saying that he wants a price on carbon, and I'm waiting for him to get on a bill, which would be a really good step if he did. So it's a mix on the Republican side, and on our side, obviously, we're all pretty, organized around the facts and concerned about the consequences.
Yeah, you mentioned the carbon border adjustment mechanism. How would that work? And is there Republican support for that?
That is the equivalent of a carbon price, but internationally. So let's say you have a cement factory in America near the Texas-Mexico border, and you got a cement factory across the border in Mexico. If the Texas factory cleans up its act and all that does is move production to Mexico and they import it, then we haven't done any good. So you have to tariff the factory across the border. And that can be either by factory or by country or by industry or by country. So there are lots of ways to do it. Republicans seem to like it for a couple of reasons. First, they like the fact that it will force China's hand to clean up its pollution act. Second, they like that certain big industries are very, very big winners. Cement, steel, pharma, aluminum. They're huge, huge wins. And third, they're motivated because the European Union's CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is already approved and is on its way first to deployment and then actual financial operation in the years ahead. So there's a forcing event that is going to come at us. So we can't just dawdle indefinitely if we want to avoid paying tariffs to the EU.
Mm-hmm. Would this border adjustment mechanism include a price on carbon? Is that part of the proposals?
In order to be effectual, it really should. In order to be politically attractive to Republicans, that's very difficult. So we're going to have to figure out how to solve that equation in the course of the negotiations. But we have robust investigations ongoing with analysts helping both Republicans and Democrats work through all the details and all the modeling and all the different economic runs that are required to get it right. And actually quite good work from the Climate Leadership Council trying to help support the effort. So it's a very promising moment. I'm not going to say we land this plane, but we're approaching the airport and in good condition.
Well, that's great to hear. Would it be like the Inflation Reduction Act where there was some sort of incentive on methane to reduce the methane emissions? Is that right?
We'll have to deal with methane. You can take the non-carbon dioxide gases and make them CO2 equivalents. And I think the carbon border tariff should actually do that. So that will help push our work on methane out into other countries because they'll have to pay the difference. But we're actually beginning to do pretty well on methane. As you know, the IRA contained the first price on greenhouse gases anywhere in the methane fee. That was my original bill. It had to be mansionized a little bit for his approval, but it's there. And the Biden administration promises to step up their game on enforcement, particularly now that satellites can find leaks so that you know where to go look.
Yeah. More generally, in terms of the global efforts, I mean, it's a global problem. Are you comfortable with what the U.S. has been doing and where we're going, especially with the next COP coming up and the stock take?
You know, I think John Kerry is a hero for what he has pulled off from his original work back in the Obama administration to light up the Paris Agreement, to his work bringing China back into the fold after the Trump years to talk climate, and all the progress that he's made with the private sector to bring big financial interests along. So I think he's doing an amazing job under the circumstances, but it's very hard to, in a friendly way, convince China that they need to pollute less if there's no economic incentive for them to pollute less. So the economic signal to other economies of the carbon border adjustment, I think, is essential to achieving our goals. And we'll see whether the next COP is real. I'm skeptical that a fossil fuel producing country who's assigned a fossil fuel company CEO to run the COP is actually going to get a whole lot accomplished. But, you know, who knows? Nixon went to China. There's always a chance.
Yeah, well, let's hope for that. I know many people have said that we've got to greatly increase the flow of capital into low carbon investments. People talk about $3 or $4 trillion a year being needed. Is the Inflation Reduction Act at the right scale? It's 396 billion over 10 years. That seems not to be at the right level. It's 2 orders of magnitude too small.
Yeah, well, it seems to be, but on the other hand, I think your former firm, Goldman Sachs, has estimated that it could go over $1 trillion because a lot of the provisions in it are open-ended. So the $3.9 billion, the $390 billion number was predicated on assumptions about what the take-up would be of various tax provisions. And there are other views, including Goldman's, that this could actually get a lot more attention and a lot more use, and therefore end up being a much bigger bill than the original modeling presumed.
Yeah, I take it you're optimistic about that as well.
Yeah, I think that's really good. There are a lot of areas, as you know very well, if you look at carbon pricing, for instance, the pushback we're getting now is, well, if you have to price carbon at its real harm, then you've got to price it at these huge numbers that will wreck the economy. And the fact of the matter is you don't. You only have to price carbon at a level that will influence behavior in the future. And our modeling for our carbon price showed that if we started as low as $50 and worked our way up in the out years to maybe $100, that had an enormous impact on decision-making in energy markets. And you don't need to just thump the consumer with a huge, fully baked in all the harms carbon price. You just need to produce the results. And I think the IRA on the demand side, by creating more demand, might be doing that.
No, that's great to hear. Anything on the horizon in Congress in terms of putting a price on carbon?
I think the likeliest thing is the carbon border tariff. I think that's really pretty key. And the Biden administration has baked a social cost of carbon into the methane rule that is now working its way up through the Environmental Protection Administration. So when that becomes law, with it, a social cost of carbon becomes law, and it's about $120 per ton. It's pretty serious. So, and once that is law, then the Office of Management and Budget can say to all of the other government agencies, okay, here's how you're going to comply with the social cost of carbon. So it matches American companies that have developed an internal carbon price, only it does it within government across purchasing, permitting, leasing, pricing, regulatory areas. And that you put the carbon border tariff and the social cost of carbon and a well-implemented Inflation Reduction Act together, and you open the door to a path to climate safety that does not exist right now.
That sounds terrific. That's a very optimistic note to end on. Thank you so much, Senator.
Well, we have to not screw it up.
Yeah, for sure. Well, hopefully you and your colleagues will be able to do that,
We'll do it. And I know the Biden administration is trying very hard, and I've got a lot of confidence in John Podesta on the Inflation Reduction Act front. Still TBD on the methane enforcement and on the carbon border tariff and on the social cost of carbon.
Yeah, and I understand there's going to be a farm bill this year, likely. It might have some climate-friendly provisions in it.
I would hope so. We got the Growing Climate Solutions Act passed with a huge vote in the Senate. And that basically says if you're a farmer, you can go to the Department of Agriculture, and you're basically the equivalent of your farm agent, can say, these are the things you can do to save carbon, and we'll pay you through offsets for that. You can actually get revenue for, adding seaweed to your cattle's feed or changing the way you put fertilizer, whatever it is. So that could change the way the agricultural community behaves once it's up and running. The bill's passed, it's law, but the Department of Agriculture hasn't gotten it up and running yet. So one focus on the farm bill is to make sure they get that done.
Well, I would guess that would be pretty popular in red states, farming states.
Absolutely. I mean, these tend to be things that people want to do anyway. You don't have to rub their nose in calling it climate change. You just say, these are things that are good and you'll be compensated for them. And here's your guy, from your county and your community who can walk you through it.
Yeah, I would think that the Republicans in those states would see the benefit of that.
I think
Who
that's why it
knows?
passed with the support of the Farm Bureau and with the support of, if my memory serves, I think we got a majority of Senate Republicans on it.
No, that's great. Great to hear. Well, thank you so much, Senator. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you, Bob, for all your leadership. You've been spectacular.
Thank you.
Risk manager of Goldman Sachs, now at Kepos Capital, very engaged in climate policy. In the sense of we don't always all agree on everything. When I wrote an op-ed on SEC disclosure, first and most biting criticism, but pivoting back to data, a lot about all the other climate policies.
Thank you.
Now it's on? Okay, great. Thank you, Gernot. It's great to be here. This is a fantastic, audience and topic. The data I'd like to look at, and if we could go to the third slide, I think here. Thank you. Yeah, this is a visualization of what we call the carbon barometer. And it's jointly produced by Kepos Capital, my firm, and also Grow Intelligence, which is a data firm that's been focused on climate. And what we're looking at here is the global incentives to reduce emissions. As the senator discussed, and I've always been, very focused on this, incentives are so important to change behavior. And what you see in this graph is very sad. It is the fact that the incentives to reduce emissions, those are the orange bars in this chart, for different countries. And you can see at the top is Spain, at the bottom is Iran. And what you see is the comprehensive incentives that multiple policies produce in different countries to reduce emissions. The main picture that you see here is that the global average price is much too low, $18.50. You also see that the United States is right below the global average, right in the center here. We essentially have no significant incentives in this country to reduce emissions. It's very sad. Now, we look at a lot of different policies and add them up. So for instance, we look at fossil fuel taxes. In the US, we do have gasoline taxes. That's where most of our incentive to reduce emissions comes from. Sadly, of course, those gasoline taxes were not put on to reduce emissions. They were put on to pay for roads. But that's basically what we've got. That's 90% of the very small incentive that we have here. What you see also is Europe has very strong incentives. The incentives in Spain and the UK are well over $100 a ton. And that comes from their emissions trading system, from their taxes on fossil fuels, from feed-in tariffs and other policies that they have to reduce emissions. The blue bars here, which I also want to focus on, are the amount of emissions by country. And so what you see is there's really a small number of countries that matter. China is by far the biggest. The United States is next. Russia, India, those are the countries that matter. And as you can see, none of those countries have strong incentives to reduce emissions. Geopolitically, countries that have significant fossil fuel reserves want to slow down the transition. Countries in Europe, in China, in India, which have less fossil fuel reserves, are going to be more supportive of rapid transition. So that's the first thing to notice. And it's very important and very sad to see that there are many countries around the world that have strong incentives to increase emissions. Of course, what's going on here is gasoline fixed prices below the market price. And so, for instance, the UAE, which is going to host the COP this year, has a negative incentive of $70 a ton. In other words, they're strongly incenting pollution, and they're leading the COP. So what can we do about this? If we go to the next slide, one idea is to create a forward-looking measure of what incentives are going to be in the future. If you think about what's going to incent those $3 to $4 trillion of investment that we need to reduce emissions and suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, we need to have expectations that in the future there's going to be an incentive. That, you know, capital flows where it expects to make profits. And so if you have strong expectations of incentives to reduce emissions in the future, you're going to make investments today. Now, many people don't have those expectations. I'm trying the best I can to increase those expectations. One way to do that is to go to governments and say, why don't you issue a bond where you signal that you're going to increase the incentive to reduce emissions? So just like TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, where the coupon and the principal are linked to a price index, you could create a bond where the coupon and principal are linked to a carbon price index. In fact, we model it here with the carbon barometer price. And what we say is if you create that bond with a signal that you're going to increase carbon prices, you know, that can have a very strong signaling. It also can create incentives for a lack of change of policy. In other words, you're signaling that where you're going. For investors, it provides an opportunity to hedge the risk that governments may not hit their targets. And it also, and very significantly, by looking at the price where a bond like this trades, just like with TIPS, you can back out what the expectations of the market are. So you have a vehicle where countries can signal what they're going to do, and also where the market reveals what expectations are. Hopefully, we can get signals like this, which will increase the incentives and increase the investment in low carbon technology.
So still optimistic.
Oh yeah, I'm very optimistic. We're going to get there. It's a question of when. I bet most people in this audience think there's no chance we're going to get a carbon price in the near future. I think it's very likely, because what's going to happen is everyone's going to wake up to the risk. And when you are in a risk management mode, you realize that time is a scarce resource. We have to move as quickly as possible. It's much too late, but I think, yeah, carbon tax is probably, you know, in the US. And by the way, it's important to recognize the US is basically the blocking agent globally. The rest of the world understands where we're going and that we need to go there quickly. They're waiting for the US to move. So it's really key that we do this.
So what about the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So we have $2 trillion. So Senator Whitehouse said $1 trillion per this Goldman Sachs estimate. By now, McKinsey is talking about $2 trillion, not just IRA, bipartisan infrastructure law, CHIPS and Science Act, couple $1 trillion, subsidies pointed in the right direction. Lots of decisions to be made along the way, like, you know, IRS rules, whether it will in fact increase or decrease emissions as a result. But a lot is happening, even or especially here.
Right, it's a step in the right direction. If you do the math, and you know, let's take the 390 that was a billion, and then you divide by 10. It's a tiny number. Now you could double it, triple it. Maybe it will be $1 billion. You know, over not $1 billion, $1 trillion. Sorry, over 10 years. You know, hopefully that's, you know, it's a step in the right direction, is what I would say.
Fair enough. I think my other job, 2 minutes. Okay, how about one question from the audience? Right here.
I feel like I'm in a concert. So thank you so much for sharing those valuable insights. My question is mainly around, do you think negative incentives in the form of taxes on carbon are actually preferable than positive incentives, like reducing taxes on technology that might reduce emission? Because we're seeing that more and more. Canada just issued their taxonomy, EU has their taxonomy. So I would like your take on that.
Yeah, well, incentives are good. Economists prefer to make polluters pay because it's very targeted. When you incent people, you know, I think the Inflation Reduction Act was good in that it basically said we will create tax breaks for any clean energy. They're not targeting solar or wind or hydrogen or whatever. So in that sense, it's pretty good. It's open-ended, but The two things are, first of all, yeah, taxes are targeted, and number two, taxes are revenue to the government. So, you know, the government has a problem. It doesn't have unlimited revenue, and so it's much better to do it with taxes than with subsidies. But incentives are incentives, so don't get me wrong.